Most of the books and blogs I have read about talk about Christianity in Conjure a lot, but I work with different deities than Yahweh. Are there any resources to separate the practice from the religion? This was a question that we were sent for Ask a Witch. As a reminder, Ask a Witch questions always answer the question from the perspective of the witch who is filming the answer. So in this particular case, I am answering this question. Sometimes it's someone else affiliated with Sanctum. These are very biased. They're not quite as biased as our rants, which are extremely biased, but they are far more biased than our more educational content. So as a reminder, it is one of the foundational tenets of Sanctum of the Craft that you do what works for you, and that you make use of these videos, the Ask a Witch videos, only in as much as it helps you to develop a practice that you are happy with. So, I've belabored that point, let me get back into this question. It continues, I feel all the info I find on Conjure in my bones. I don't know how else to describe it, but I also feel like there is a push away from it because of the Christian aspect. It's like I'm being led in circles. Now, I want to answer this from a slightly more umbrella perspective than specifically Conjure. There is a debate on cultural appropriation, specifically within the field of what gets called Conjure. So I'm going to open it up into a broader topic, which is that of Southern and Appalachian folk magic, which I feel is more open to more people. Now, Southern and Appalachian folk magic contains within it cunning work, clever work, conjure, hoodoo, root working, etc. Some of which are closed, some of which are open. But the umbrella, folk magic in general, from that region, I believe is much more open specifically to people who live there, where there were people from all different kinds of ethnic and racial backgrounds, all different cultures, who all practice something that would exist underneath that umbrella term. People who were descended primarily from Europeans, people who were descended primarily from Africans, all practicing something underneath the umbrella of Southern Appalachian folk magic. So I hope that helps. That's what I'm going to answer. I personally do not struggle to separate Christianity out of what gets called Southern or Appalachian folk magic. That is because the person who primarily taught me was emphatically anti-Yahweh. Now, not specifically anti-Christianity, because she had been raised in a Jewish household. She was specifically anti the deity that gets worshipped as the primary deity of both Judaism and theoretically Christianity. There's a debate about the Christian versus the Jewish God. They certainly don't worship in the same fashion. She had a major bone to pick with Yahweh. She absolutely despised him and felt that he had repeatedly betrayed her people. That is her specific belief, and I support her in believing that based on the things that she had had happen to her in her life. When she told me that she wanted to rip him down from his throne and why, I understood and supported that perspective. So the person who primarily trained me was emphatically anti the deity primarily associated with Judaism and with Christianity. So to me, what I was primarily trained in didn't involve a worship or obeisance of Yahweh. However, I can acknowledge that Christianity is really, really woven through the practice. Like a lot of the books that come out on that practice have a lot of Christianity woven through them, because in many places throughout the South, throughout the Appalachian Mountains, Christianity is very heavily woven through the practice. So although it is not hard for me, I do understand why it would be hard for some people. So I am aware that a lot of the books that get put out teaching people how to practice this have a very Christian focus. I do buy the books, I do read them. I just don't necessarily incorporate what they teach into what I practice. I primarily read them because I want to know what is being taught about the system that I identify with. I read them as a matter of ongoing research, and because I do believe that no matter how much you practice something, it is always good to return to fundamentals, to learn from other teachers, to incorporate those basics into your daily practice and make sure that you never ever stop learning. So yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way to put this without being insulting to anyone else. I am aware that at least one of the authors on the topic of Southern or Appalachian folk magic deeply dislikes my content. I'm aware of the blog post that they made supposedly debunking me and my background that completely misquoted me. I am aware. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't point people towards their research if I thought that their research would be helpful to them. I'm also just not going to name that person. That all being said, I don't generally use those books as a guide to how to practice myself because, again, they tend to be one specific branch of this practice that I don't really identify with or cleave to. So let me point you to some resources other than those books, not trying to denigrate those books, by all means make use of them, but some resources other than that I do make use of and incorporate into my practice. I absolutely adore books that are written more to preserve the culture as a whole than books that are written specifically to teach someone how to practice the magical end of it, because it is such a cultural practice, and you can take the culture as a whole preserved throughout your daily life and then weave the magic back through. Because what the granny witches were doing was living their lives, and magic was part of it. Whether that was planting by the signs or healing or buying warts off a person, it was all part of their daily life and the way that they served their community. So understanding the daily backbone of the practice and then weaving the magic through, I believe is very helpful and is how I primarily practice. So I adore books that are about preserving the culture as a whole. And sometimes they also incidentally preserve some of the granny witchcraft, but the whole point is to preserve the entirety of the culture. So for example, I love the Foxfire collection. I own absolutely every book they've ever put out. I highly recommend every single book. Yes, there is a book that specifically delves into granny witchcraft, just like there's a book that specifically delves into moonshine making. But I love all of the books. I make use of the cookbook. I make use of their guides to preserving things in the kitchen. Someday I'm building their smokehouse that they have instructions for. I adore them. And additionally, I like their podcast, and I'm devastated that it is no longer running. They had a few years and they're not putting out any new episodes, and I've listened to all of the episodes. But it's called It Still Lives. And they play clips from the original interviews where people went to the Appalachian Mountains and they recorded their interviews with people. And each of the podcast episodes has a specific focus. So like, again, there is one on granny witchcraft. There is a fantastic Halloween section. Don't know why it's suddenly getting so dark in here. I don't know what's happening. So we're just gonna have a dramatic light shift in this class, for which I apologize. Right when I mentioned Halloween too, there's a phenomenal Halloween portion. There is again a portion on moonshining. I really adore that podcast. So I'm just gonna point you all at the Foxfire collection and say that that has been foundational for me in preserving the wisdom of my teacher and people like her, and incorporating that folk tradition, including the folk magic, into every aspect of my daily life. Additionally, I really like the Country Wisdom and Know-How books, which I purchased from an anarchist press online called AK Press. and I make use of those books as well, and I really enjoy them. And again, preserving that culture is very important to me, and I preserve the culture as a whole and then weave my magic through it. So additionally, anything that is written from a folk healing perspective, I find very useful. I have a phenomenal encyclopedia of folk healing that I turn to over and over and over again. It is ridiculously well cited, which of course I adore. And I do believe it is where at least one author who has a blog where they say a lot of folk healing methods that have been used. I think that they probably own this book, just based on the commonality of the sources. Not saying it's their only source, I just think it is one of their sources that they are using in order to put together those blog entries. And those blog entries are amazing, phenomenal. Highly recommend that blog, which I think is called like Ozark Man Mountain Healing. Yeah, something like that. I'll put it in subtitles below. But I think that this book was probably at least one of their many sources. And it then also cites a lot of sources, which then you can go find. And a lot of the folk healing ends up overlapping or being indistinguishable from the folk magic. And the sources that the encyclopedia links to often go into more detail of various other magical traditions. So I highly recommend anything that's written from an anthropological perspective as well, that is supposed to be exploring the history and the culture of the region from a perspective of studying it in order to preserve it, rather than a book that was written for like Llewellyn Press. So that's just another thing that you can try. Anyway, I hope that this is helpful to you. If you would like more detail, please let me know in the comments below, or you can message us on Discord, or you can email us at staff@sanctumofthecraft.org, or you can send us other questions for Ask a Witch. We're happy to answer them. Also, I wanted to bring attention to the fact that we do have some of our Southern and Appalachian folk magic recipes and things on our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/sanctumofthecraft. I just posted one recently all on wart cures, so that's on there, and we will be posting more along with all of our other content on things like death magic and crisis preparedness and herbalism for AFAB autonomy and tarot. So you can find us at patreon.com/sanctumofthecraft. Again, that's patreon.com/sanctumofthecraft, and our Patreon does start at $1 a month. So, okay, be safe out there, everyone.